Commander Gordon Otis from Class 13, USN TPS. Here to talk to us about the life and the mission of TPS in 1954, when his class was the first class to be named actually the Test Pilot School.
That's right.
If you could tell us a little bit about the aircraft and the times that were immediately following World War II. A little about your World War II time, take us up to TPS, and then talk about the Patuxent River community. That'd be great, sir.
All right. See if I can do that. In fact, I welcome the opportunity to pass this along, because the patrol plane Navy, at least the flying boat Navy, didn't get very much credit during World War II, and I'm glad to see it getting some these days. I was a reserve officer originally, later transferred to regular Navy, made a career out of it, and most of my career was in anti-submarine warfare in one form or another. Went through flight training in Jacksonville, Florida in 1941 and 42, and from there I went to Norfolk and got checked out in the Martin Mariner flying boats, twin-engine flying boats. Had about a 97-foot wingspan and weighed about 146,000 pounds. It had two big 1,800 engines, 1,800 horsepower engines. Carried a crew of 8 to 10 on it. Carried a bomb load of 8,000 pounds. It had 3 turrets and 2 side guns on it. The turrets were twin-engine 50 caliber. The side guns were 50 caliber. And it had a pretty potent defense capability. And the original planes also had armor plating on them to give us some protection. The reason that we took most of that stuff off was because we were stationed in the Atlantic hunting the German submarines, which almost lost the war for us before it started. They were sinking ships right off the coast of Jacksonville against the lights of Jacksonville Beach while I was going through flight training. And it took us a while to back out the beaches before we got wise to the fact that the submarines were using them. My pet here. This is Merlin. Anyway, the PBM was a very useful airplane, and we formed a lot of squadrons of it using that model airplane. And my squadron was BP 202, formed in 1942. It had about 365 officers and men in it, 18 planes, and we shipped down in Corpus Christi and then went to Key West, Florida, thinking we were going to Recife and Dakar to support the North Atlantic, not the North Atlantic, but the North African invasion. But they decided to make Key West our home port, so our squadron patrolled the Gulf and the Caribbean, out as far as the Bahamas and down halfway down the Caribbean. We operated out of an advanced base in the Isle of Pines, south of Cuba, using an open seaplane base in a harbor down there. Wasn't much of a place in those days. It's quite a scuba diving capital down there now, incidentally. But anyway, I was in that squadron for 2 years. I was a junior ensign in the squadron and made patrol plane commander about 6 months before I went to my second squadron.
About a year and a half.
And made Lieutenant JG at about the same time. So I went to my second squadron as a Lieutenant JG. Our mission in those days was to hunt submarines, either by patrolling the coastline or by covering convoys. And of course, Key West is right on the pivot point of all the shipping from the Gulf and from the Caribbean up the East Coast, so it was a very vital place down there at the time. They had the fleet sonar school there also, training surface ships and torpedo work and that kind of thing. We had some interesting experiences in those days. This is 1942 and 43. Actually, I only saw one submarine that whole time, and I was the navigator that day. We were cruising about 6,000 feet, which is much too high. We usually cruised about 1,200 feet. And we spotted one through the clouds on the surface. And the patrol plane commander went into a dive to dive bomb this thing. And I took a picture of the submarine between the pilots as we were coming down, ran back to the after station and took some pictures as we went over. So unfortunately, the bombs landed about 200 feet beyond the submarine and shook him up, but didn't kill it. But we had the guns going, and the bombs dropped, and it was a great run. And another plane came over shortly thereafter to work it over, and he made a beautiful bombing run, but he was doing 180 knots, and the bomb bay doors wouldn't open. So we lost him again. But anyway, we did many an hour of flying, covering the coastline down there in the shipping. Just by being there, it kept the submarines away from the surface ships, and the surface ships would hug the shore. Well, after that, I went to VPB 215, which is a heavier-than-air patrol bombing squadron. They changed the designation. It's essentially the same type of operation. And we went to Trinidad, Cocosolo, and worked out of there covering the bauxite route, which is the ore for aluminum, vital ore for making airplanes, of course. And about halfway through there, we got secret orders one night to load up our beaching gear in the bomb bays, and enough gear for a month, and we didn't open our orders when we got in the air. So 6 of us took off about 2 o'clock in the morning, opened our orders, and headed a 10-hour flight away for Cocosolo Canal Zone. And we went over there, lived in the seaplane, the submarine base quarters, and operated out of Cocosolo to protect the entrance to the canal zone and look for submarines that we knew were down there, because he was sinking ships all across the northern part of South America. And the most interesting experience I had there was one night I was out on night patrol with 4 other airplanes that in a sector where we knew the submarine was, but hadn't pinned him down yet. There wasn't supposed to be any surface shipping at all in that area because they'd been warned off. So we had orders to attack if we sound anything. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, on a pitch black night with just a little bit of a moon, I picked up a very sharp radar contact. And in these days, we didn't have searchlights. We didn't have fancy radar, although we did have an earlier type of radar. We did not have MAD gear, or magnetic anomaly detection gear. We didn't have sonobuoys. We had sonobuoys, but they weren't directional. Anyway, in order to illuminate a submarine at night, we dropped flares. And the technique on this was to climb to 1,200 feet upwind, go crosswind, drop 4 flares, make a 270-degree turn, and getting down to 350 feet, open your bomb bay doors, and when the flares went off, you're supposed to catch the submarine between you and the flares. Well, the flares went off, and I pulled up between the masts of a big Esso New Orleans tanker that shouldn't have been there. Every light in that ship came on. He stopped dead in the water and started to abandon ship. So I closed my bomb bay doors and circled around with an Aldous lamp and told him there's a sub in the air to get out of there. But anyway, shortly thereafter, one of the other squadrons got that submarine going out the Windward Passage, and they transferred our squadron to Bermuda, which is a very delightful place to live, but kind of isolated. It's an island out in the middle of the Atlantic, as you know. Anyway, we covered, most notable there, we covered convoys headed for Europe for the Normandy Invasion. And the biggest convoy I covered there was the Normandy Invasion fleet, which consisted of over 800 ships coming from every port on the East Coast, converging just north of Bermuda and heading out 4 abreast. It took me 40 minutes to fly at 120 knots down the length of that column before I got to the end of it. And down at the end of it was a straggler, dead in the water. So I circled around him until he got it started, so to protect him from being attacked. But just by being out there or patrolling along the convoys, we kept the submarines away from the convoys until they got further out in the Atlantic. Of course, the convoy also had surface ships protecting the destroyers. So after that, I was sent to Corpus Christi as an instructor in PBMs for some of the pilots that were going to the Pacific squadrons, and soon found myself with a set of orders to a squadron out in Guam. And at the same time, I was offered a chance to join the regular Navy and go to California Institute of Technology. So you can understand which one I went to there. And I was out there when the war ended. They dropped the atomic bomb, and that's ended that one pretty fast. I came back to the training command, went to Alaska for a couple of years in the maintenance squadron, and from there I went to the U.S. Navy Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, to make up for some of the schooling I hadn't had in the Navy, and the fact that I had not been to the academy. And from there I went to the Bureau of Naval Weapons, Eastern District Office in Brooklyn Navy Yard on the staff. From there I went to BX-1 in Key West, which was a operational training squadron for developing tactics to use the equipment that was being tested and developed at Patuxent and at Johnsville. At BX-1 I was privileged to be the project officer on the first P5M, which was the successor to the PBM. This is a book which is dedicated to the flying boats. You start out with the PBM, went to the P5M, and later to the Jet Seamaster, which was a 4-jet mine layer. And after working with the special radar in the P5M for a couple of years down in BX-1, I went to Test Pilot School in Class 13 in 1954. This is the P5M, and this is the famous PBM shot with the JATO lift that we took out of Kaneohe Bay. Very famous picture. Anyway, this particular book has got accounts of all of the seaplane pilots and their crews from both the Atlantic and the Pacific, and I highly recommend it to anybody that would like to purchase one. They cost about $30, and they're available from the what do they call it, the Turner Press. The Turner Press. A very interesting book. Anyway, you wanted to know about the Test Pilot School in those days.
Yes, sir.
So Class 13, they called Thirsty 13 because its insignia was a beer mug with a froth over the top, a 13 on the side. The reason we chose that symbol was because the pilots all gathered at the famous Jack Ruse Roost in Lexington Park, right outside the gate at Patuxent. And we let down our hair a little bit on Friday nights. The rest of the time we studied day and night for our test. This is quite a while ago, 37, now it's 1994. So in those days we had, we were using in the Test Pilot School such planes as the F-9, F-2 Cougar jet fighter, the A-D, which is now called an A-1 Martin Marauder. No, that was a Douglas plane, the A-1. We had a B-24. We had what they used on Korea. They had the Cutlass. They had F-6Fs, F-8Fs, and can't think of the name of the third plane, but the current fighter at that time. The P-4, or the F-4 Phantom was just being developed. I sat in on the mock-up board on that one out in St. Louis, and I later got to fly the F-2H McDonnell Voodoo, which was a twin-engine McDonnell fighter. Our particular group had a UH-16 Grumman Albatross amphibian, an F-9, F-2, 4, 5, and 8 Grumman fighters, and we had the AD as our primary planes, but we also got to fly practically everything the school had to be able to check out in it. We used to have a knee pad with the vital statistics of each airplane for a check-off list, and we'd flip off of that plane, put it on a clipboard, go out and get in the airplane, give ourselves a check-out, and off we'd go. First, well, you understand, I was a seaplane pilot. Never been over 180 knots in my life at that time. And then when I came to test pilot school, they said, well, you're a test pilot, aren't you? You're going to be flying this F-9, F-2 jet fighter. I said, well, I've never been near a jet, you know. So they gave me a backseat ride in a T-1, which was the original jet fighter plane built by the United States. The T-1 was the Navy designation for it. And he said, don't worry about learning this one because you're not going to be flying it. So I took a NATOPS, Navy Standard Operating Procedure test on the F-9F, got a cockpit checkout, learned how to start the thing, poured the coal through it, and before I got off the runway, I was going faster than I've ever been in my life. I was doing 220 knots before I even got to the end of the runway, pulled it straight up, and it started to snow in the cockpit. I had the air conditioning on full blast on it, and I got up to 10,000 feet in about 5 minutes flat. Couldn't believe it. And later, I had quite a bit of time in the F-9F series, and we had a bunch of canned exercises in those days. I suppose they still do the same thing, about 54 different tests that we'd go out and run through all the stability control and performance tests that the test pilot school was training us for. And then we'd come back and write it up and get our results. So we were actually taking the test points on a knee pad and with a camera mounted behind our head, photographing the instrument panel. And we got our data off of that instead of real-time telemetry that they're using these days. If you go to the Test Pilot Museum, you'll see some of this old equipment that we used in those days. But from the Test Pilot School, we had a lot of good times. One particular party I remember out at the Oak Club, we had quite a few of the wives who were pregnant at the time, and they had got all dressed up and did a South Sea Island version of South Pacific called Belly High instead of Bally High. It was really all right.
Same old club as they have now, sir.
So we partied well, and we also worked hard. And I put in for flight tests like everybody else did, but no, everybody can't go to flight test. And they wanted me for the P5 and the P6M anyway. So they sent me to the electronics test division in those days. And the P6M was not quite ready yet. They sent me to the factory training school at Renault Martin plant for all the groundwork on it, check out on it, got all the publications. I was going to be the project pilot for all the electronics equipment in the P6M. And unfortunately, they had troubles with it, and they crashed two of them before I got out of test pilot school, and so I never got to fly it. But I continued in the P5M we had there, and the R4D and the F3D and the F2Hs and some of the other planes we had. P2V2, P2V5, P2V7 I flew. These are all early patrol planes. And of course they kept us pretty much still in our own trained profession. The fighters, the fighter planes, the patrol planes, the patrol, attack, and so forth. And they scattered the test pilots trained to all the test divisions to utilize their abilities to the best of their education and background, which makes sense, of course. Well, I dropped a lot of sonobuoys. I did TACAN work, tactical navigation. I did a lot of radar patterns for the testing radars, flying antenna patterns. About that time we got a 4-engine flying boat called a P5Y. It had 8 Allison jet engines and a turboprop engines, turning 4 counter-rotating props. And it was the biggest airplane I'd ever seen in my life at the time. It would go from a dead stop to 10,000 feet in 12 minutes and weighed about something in the neighborhood of 280,000-pound airplane. And they later used it for transpacking for cargo work to replace the Mars, Martin Mars, that was used for that purpose. But that in general is what we did in those days, and I hope that will give you some idea of what patrol plane pilots and what Test Pilot School was doing in those days.
Yes, sir. What brought you back to Patuxent River to settle down, sir?
Well, I like Patuxent very much. I always have, and my wife does. And we had participated in the local community affairs, churches and whatnot. And I left here. I went to an aircraft carrier, the USS Tarawa, CBS 40, as the Combat Information Center officer on this anti-submarine warfare carrier, and spent 3 years on that at a ship's company, chasing submarines and participating in NATO exercises. And we went to the Med and on a cruise and came back. From there, we also went to the Antarctic to work with the Norton Sound and a destroyer to test the Van Allen radiation belt, which you may have heard of. The theory was that the magnetic lines of detection on the magnetic lines at the South Pole all converged, and we actually fired off a nuclear rocket in the upper atmosphere from the Norton Sound, and we put our planes above the overcast to observe and took radar pictures of it, and actually verified that you could see the magnetic lines, because when the bomb went off, it went in a big streak like that, and proving that they were there, as we knew, of course. We also primarily worked with Task Group Bravo, which was we had 8 destroyers and 2 submarines in our carrier. So we go out for operational readiness inspections and work in local exercises in that group. After that, I had a tour on the Bureau of Naval Weapons, which is now the Naval Air Systems Command, which is the one that procures the airplanes for Patuxent to test, of course. And from there, I went to a VW squadron, Super Constellations, 4-engine radar planes. They were used on the North Atlantic Barrier Patrol to extend the Pine Tree radar defense line across northern Canada and across the North Atlantic to Europe. And we kept 4 airplanes in the air day and night for 10 years without a break. We had VW-13, VW-15 here at Patuxent, and VW-11, a double squadron in Georgetown, Newfoundland. VW-13 had 18 planes and 18 crews and 14 airplanes, and we would fly all kinds of weather, day and night, summer and winter. I think I piled up 2,265 hours in 3 years on a barrier patrol, which was 2,265 miles long, believe it or not. We went from Argenton, Newfoundland to the Azores and back non-stop. do that for 2 weeks, come back to Patuxent and train, go back and do it again. And after that, I went to the USS Wasp, which was also an ASW carrier, stationed in Boston. And we went on a NATO cruise up there. I was on the staff, the Commander Carrier Division 14 staff, working with Task Group Alpha and Bravo, which again consisted of carrier, 8 destroyers, and a couple of submarines. And the most interesting part of that was the NATO cruise we went on. It had ships from 8 different countries. And we had something like 88 different surface ships, and two strike carriers and 2 ASW carriers. We had a British carrier, and had a Brazilian carrier with us, and we went way up above the Arctic Circle, up off the Faroe Islands, up off the coast of Norway up there, and the Russian Badgers and bombers were jumping us every day, and we'd send out patrols to watch for them. And they were pretty worried that we were actually going to invade them that time, but we were just on an exercise. Anyway, after that, we came back to Patuxent again for my final tour of duty, and I was operations officer of the base, which was a very interesting job for 2 years, and administration officer for a year. And altogether, I had 28 years of service, and loved every minute of it.
Why did you come here?
What brought you back here, sir? Did you raise your family here, is that right?
Yes, my daughter was born here. We had one son that was born in Pasadena when I was in Caltech. We had another son born in Carmel while I was going to postgraduate school in Monterey. And our daughter was born here, right here in the base of Patuxent. And they're all married now. I got children, of course. But we liked it here. We had 3 tours of duty here. Bought a house here, and we're still in the house that we bought. And we're going to stay here, I guess, for our retirement.
Outstanding.
We participate in the local community affairs quite a bit also.
Outstanding. Well, thank you very much, sir, for all your stories and your insights on the last few years here. Thanks very much.
Well, the continuity wasn't complete, but that's the idea anyway.
With the Navy facilities near to Washington, our kids are around.
Right.
So it was just the right spot for us.
Right. You don't often
could stick that
find.
part in there if you wanted it.
Sure.
Okay, is it going again?
Yep, ready to go.
Okay, you asked why we came back here. I would say it was because both my wife and I liked the town and the county very much. My wife was a school teacher, taught elementary school, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade, and later on taught school teachers in St. Mary's College. We joined the Methodist Church and later the Episcopalian Church in town, and have been quite active in the local community affairs. And we like the sailing, we like the access to the base and the retirement community that we have here. We have a very fine Retired Officers Association with over 180 members in it. And there's a very active Fleet Reserve Squadron here, TROA, Retired Officers Association. And we just like living here. We came here because it's too cold in Connecticut and too hot.
Imagination takes him on exciting adventures.
They love Timmy. So do I.
But watch out for the cavity goon.
Bob and Doris Hart had lived in the same house in the suburbs of Indianapolis, Indiana for 12 years. Each day usually began with the same comfortable routine. But on the morning of March 28, 1991, their lives took an unexpected and